A billionaire hears a knock at his front door, and the woman standing there changes everything with 6 words. What she reveals next will leave him shattered and the world watching. The afternoon sun shimmered over the Pacific, casting molten reflections on the still surface of the infinity pool, just beyond the edge of the Whitmore estate. Perched high above the coastline, the sprawling mansion was a marvel of glass, stone, and silence. No staff bustled in the halls. No music echoed from the grand piano. Only the soft crackle of a fire in the library disturbed the quiet. Charles Whitmore sat alone in a high-backed leather chair, a book resting open in his lap, though. His eyes hadn't moved across the page in several minutes. At 71, Charles looked as carefully maintained as his empire. Clean-shaven, crisp navy cardigan, wire-rimmed glasses perched on the edge of his nose. His hair had turned an elegant silver, combed back with precision. He looked like a man who had long stopped rushing, long stopped explaining himself. His world was controlled, curated, and very, very quiet. The knock startled him. It echoed through the marble corridor outside the library, sharp, deliberate, out of place. Charles furrowed his brow. No one ever knocked. People were buzzed in, scheduled, cleared. He set the book down and rose slowly, his slippers brushing over polished hardwood as he made his way to the front door. The heavy oak creaked as it opened, revealing the unexpected. A woman stood there, silhouetted by the sun behind her. Late 20s, maybe early 30s. Deep brown skin, natural curls pinned back with quiet elegance. Her posture was upright, her hands steady on the handle of a modest suitcase beside her. She wore jeans, a cream blouse, and a long tan coat. Nothing flashy. But everything about her presence was intentional, like someone who knew exactly what this moment meant. Charles stared. She didn't flinch. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice polite but cautious. She looked him in the eye, steady, calm, unwavering, and said 6 words, "I think you're my father." The world seemed to pause. The sound of the waves, the ticking of the clock in the hall, even the crackle of the fire behind him, all faded into the background as Charles's brain tried to parse what he'd just heard. His lips parted, but no words came out. "I'm sorry to come like this," the woman said softly, "but I needed to know if it was true." Charles blinked, his throat dry. I think you have the wrong—" "My mother's name was Anita Collins," she interrupted gently. "She worked for you in the mid-90s, in your Palo Alto research division. She was a software engineer. You were just starting out then." The name struck him like a chord he hadn't heard in years. Anita. It had been decades since he'd let himself think about her. Even longer since anyone had spoken her name aloud in this house. "I have a letter from her," the woman continued, reaching into her coat and pulling out a small envelope. "She gave it to me before she passed. It says I should come here." Charles looked at the envelope, then back at her. His heart thudded once, loud and unfamiliar. She didn't beg. She didn't shout. She simply waited. He stepped aside. "Come in," he said. The interior of the Whitmore estate was like a museum. Clean lines, towering ceilings, art hung with clinical precision. Naomi stepped inside slowly, her eyes taking in the cold elegance. The hush of the marble floors beneath her boots, the absence of personal touches, the sharp scent of fresh polish in the air. It all whispered one thing: distance. Charles led her into the sunken living room. The fireplace crackled low, casting amber light against steel and stone. He gestured to a chair but remained standing, arms loosely crossed. She didn't sit immediately. Instead, she turned to face him fully, her hands clasped in front of her. "My mother's name was Anita Collins," she said calmly, voice steady. "She worked at Whitmore Systems, in Palo Alto, mid-90s, research assistant in the language processing division." Charles tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "That was a long time ago." "I know." She gave a faint smile. "You probably wouldn't remember every employee." "I remember most," he said. "That team was small back then. Early days." Naomi nodded once. "She said you were ambitious, restless, brilliant, and very married." Charles looked away for a beat. "She said you were kind to her," Naomi continued. At first, then distant. And then, she was reassigned. Quietly. No explanation. No confrontation. Just gone. Charles walked to the bar, poured himself glass of water. He offered her one, but she declined. She never spoke badly about you, Naomi said gently. She just didn't speak of you much at all. I always thought it was because it hurt her. He took a slow sip, then looked at her over the rim of the glass. So you came all this way on a feeling? No, she said, reaching into her coat pocket. I came because of this. She held out a folded letter, edges worn, the ink faded. It was with her will. She wrote that you might be my father. She never wanted to force anything. She was scared. But she also didn't want me to go through life not knowing. Charles didn't reach for the letter. I'm not here to ask for money, Naomi said. I'm not here for revenge or even recognition. I just want to know the truth. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the quiet like a bell. He stared at the letter for a moment longer, then finally took it and placed it beside him on the table, unread for now. I remember Anita, he said finally. I remember her being sharp, smarter than half the senior staff, quiet but not shy, a lot of potential. But not enough protection, Naomi replied, without malice. Just fact. Charles nodded slowly. I don't remember anything else. A pause. A lie? A shield? I don't blame you for not being sure, Naomi said. DNA doesn't lie. That's all I'm asking for. He studied her face then, really studied it. Her posture, her jawline, her eyes. There was something in them. Something he recognized. Not from memory, but from the mirror. All right, he said after a long silence. We'll do the test. Discreetly. My private physician can handle it. Naomi nodded once. Thank you. I'll have them come tomorrow. I'd rather this not get public. Neither would I. He glanced at the letter again, but didn't open it. She turned to leave. Where are you staying? He asked. A small hotel downtown, she said. I didn't want to presume. He hesitated, then nodded. I'll have someone take you. Back. As she stepped toward the front door, Charles called her name, his voice just slightly softer now. Naomi. She turned. You said you didn't come for recognition. But if this turns out to be true, what then? She gave him a look that was both thoughtful and piercing. Then it's not about what you do next. It's about whether you'll let yourself see what was already there. And with that, she stepped out into the fading light. Charles stood, alone in the grand silence, the unopened letter still beside him. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel quite so in control. The rain came later that night. Not a storm, just a slow, persistent drizzle that painted the windows in streaks and softened the edges of the coastal view. Charles sat alone in his study, the lights dimmed, the fire long extinguished. In front of him, a manila folder lay open, filled with faded memos and project rosters from over 30 years ago. His fingers hovered over one photo, black and white, slightly curled at the edges, a team portrait from the early days of Whitmore Systems. A dozen young engineers standing in front of a whiteboard filled with messy equations, and there, off to the left, slightly separated from the others, was Anita. She wore a turtleneck and wide-leg slacks. Her hair was pulled back, her posture upright, and her smile, tight but present, seemed to flicker with quiet restraint. She was the only black woman in the photo, the only one not leaning in toward the center. Charles stared at her image, the years falling away. Flashback, late 1990s. The office was cramped, buzzing with energy, and suffused with the optimism of innovation. Charles was younger then, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, always moving. He lived off caffeine, ambition, and adrenaline. Every day was a pitch, every hallway conversation a negotiation. Anita had stood out from day one, not because of her background, but because of her mind. She had a way of cutting through noise, of solving code issues without needing to grandstand. She asked smart questions, listened harder than most, and delivered better than anyone. Charles noticed. He remembered watching her during a late-night debugging session, glasses slipping down her nose, fingers flying across the keyboard. She didn't seek praise. She earned it, and she smiled just once when he brought her coffee without asking. But soon the whispers began. She's always in his office. Funny how she got reassigned to the flagship project. Don't you think he's playing favorites? Charles had always cared about optics. Investors, board members, the press, they all watched closely, and he had built his reputation on strategy, not scandal. So he reassigned her, quietly, painlessly. He told himself it was to protect her, that she'd land on her feet, that it was better this way. He never spoke to her again. Present day. Charles closed the folder, jaw tense. The guilt was old, but tonight it returned with a sharper edge. He picked up his phone and called the only man he trusted with these kinds of truths. "Martin," he said when the line picked up, "I need to talk." A half hour later, his lawyer sat across from him, damp umbrella resting against the wall. Martin Pierce had been with Charles since the beginning. Gray-haired, blunt, and surgically discreet, she showed up out of nowhere? Martin asked, adjusting his glasses. "Just like that?" Charles nodded. "She has a letter from Anita. She says I'm her father." "And what do you think?" "I don't know." Martin folded his hands. "Charles, let me ask you something. Man to man. When was the last time you thought about Anita Collins?" Charles looked down. "It's been years. But you remember her." A pause. "Yes," Martin studied him. "You built an empire preaching merit, equality, innovation. But I was there when people were getting reassigned for less than a rumor." Charles didn't respond. "She may be your daughter," Martin said softly. "And if that's true, you owe her mother more than a blood test. You owe her a reckoning." Charles exhaled slowly. After Martin left, Charles wandered the house, room to room, searching for something. He didn't know what. In the back of a cabinet, he found an old storage box from the Palo Alto office. Printed memos, team bios, ID badges, and a sticky note, written in Anita's handwriting. "Charles, fix the line issue in Module 12. Hope it saves your pitch." He smiled despite himself. He remembered that day. Her fix had saved the pitch, and he'd never thanked her. He sat back down in the study, staring into the fire that had long gone cold. In the quiet, he could almost hear her voice again. And in that voice, familiar now, he heard Naomi's. The same quiet certainty, the same sharp grace, the same mind. Something stirred in him. A question, rising from beneath years of justification and silence. What if she's not just telling the truth? What if I already know it? The envelope arrived 2 days later. It sat on the mahogany desk in Charles's study, cream-colored and embossed with the logo of his private physician's clinic. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he stared at it as if the paper itself could alter the laws of time, undo choices, rewrite memory. But the truth didn't wait. It never did. He finally slit the seal open with his letter opener and unfolded the lab report. DNA test. Result: positive. Probability of paternity, 99.98%. The page didn't tremble in his hands, but something inside him did. He leaned back in. His chair, closed his eyes, and let the weight of it settle. Naomi was his daughter. His, not a rumor, not a maybe, a fact backed by science, as irrefutable as the sunrise. He thought of the way she had stood at his door, unshaken, the precision in her words, the way her eyes scanned everything, not with entitlement, but quiet curiosity. Her mother's poise, his stubbornness. Charles rose from his seat, walked to the window, and stared out at the ocean. The world hadn't changed, but his had. Later that evening, he called her. "I have the results," he said, voice low. "I know," she replied. "You knew before the paper." There was a short silence. Then, "I've always known." He invited her to return the next day, said he wanted to speak face to face. She agreed. The next morning, Naomi stood in the same foyer, suitcase gone, posture the same. Charles had prepared a formal letter acknowledging paternity. He'd even contacted a PR consultant, thinking it might be time to release a controlled statement. After all, everything he did had a structure, a strategy. But as they sat across from each other in the sunlit conservatory, Naomi shook her head, gently when he handed her the document. "I don't want that," she said. Charles looked confused. "You don't want recognition?" She smiled, not with bitterness but with a kind of sad grace. "I already have recognition. I run my own company. I publish. I speak at universities. I'm not here for your name or your money." Charles slowly set the papers down. "Then why did you come?" Naomi's expression changed. Something older, deeper, flickered in her gaze. "I came because my mother spent her whole life never being seen for who she was," she said. "She was brilliant, you knew that. But when things got complicated, you protected your name, not her career." He swallowed hard. "She told me about the whispers," Naomi continued, "about the reassignment, about how she didn't fight it because she was scared of ruining you, scared that speaking up would make her the problem." Charles's eyes dropped. Naomi leaned forward, voice softer now. "You built your empire on the image of being progressive, forward-thinking, inclusive. But when it counted most, you let her disappear." "She asked me to let it go," Charles said quietly. "Back then." She was silenced before she had a chance to decide what her voice was worth. That landed like a stone in the space between them. "I didn't come to shame you," she added. "I came to ask why. Why didn't you ever come looking for her, or for me?" Charles ran a hand over his face. He looked older than he had in days past, like truth had stripped him of his polished armor. "Because I was a coward," he admitted. "Because I told myself I was doing the right thing, protecting everyone. But really I was just protecting myself." Naomi nodded, but didn't soften. "I needed to hear that," she said. "Not just for me, for her." They sat in silence. For a moment, both staring out the window as wind brushed through the coastal pines. Charles turned to her again. "What happens now?" "That's up to you," Naomi replied. "I don't need a father. I had a mother who gave me strength, but I think you need a truth you can live with." And with that she stood, tall, composed, complete in a way that had nothing to do with where she came from, and everything to do with who she had become. As she reached the door, Charles called out one last time, "Naomi." She turned. "I'm sorry." This time she nodded. "So am I." The next morning, the air was heavy with fog. Pale mist curled around the stone pillars lining the estate's gardens, softening the sharp lines of the hedges and statues. Charles walked alone through the dew-kissed grass, hands in his coat pockets, footsteps slow, deliberate. The land that once felt like his kingdom now felt like an echo chamber. Every tree, every stone, whispering questions he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. He paused by the koi pond, staring at the ripples that distorted his reflection. The man who looked back at him wasn't the polished executive who'd graced magazine covers or the charming speaker who captivated boardrooms. This version of himself looked tired, human, real. The night before had stripped something bare in him. He thought of Naomi's face, composed but not cold, the way she carried her mother's fire with her own restraint. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't asked for anything. That was what unsettled him most. She wanted nothing from him except for the truth, not the one carefully curated for the public, but the one he'd buried behind decades of ambition. He sat on a nearby bench, his breath fogging lightly in the morning air. How many people had he stepped over in his climb? How many brilliant minds like Anita's had been minimized, reassigned, erased, just to protect the image of a progressive empire? He'd always believed in innovation, in meritocracy, in inclusion. He'd written books on it, funded scholarships, hired the best PR firms to polish the message. But when it had counted, when the right thing threatened the foundation he was building, he'd turned away. He hadn't protected Anita. He hadn't looked for Naomi. He'd protected himself. The guilt wasn't a scream. It was a quiet, persistent ache in his chest, the kind that came with age, when legacy stopped being about buildings and revenue and started being about people. He didn't hear Naomi approach. She'd come alone, no appointment, no announcement, just as she had the first time. She stopped, a few paces from him, hands folded in front of her, watching him silently for a moment before speaking. "You walk like the weight just hit," she said gently. Charles looked up, startled, then nodded, managing a weak smile. "It did," he gestured. To the bench beside him. "Would you sit with me?" She did. There was a long pause filled with bird song and breeze. "I was a coward," he said finally. His voice cracked at the edges. "I hid behind my success because I was too afraid of losing it. I built everything to avoid becoming the man my father was, cold, withholding. But in doing that, I became something worse. I became calculated." Naomi listened, her expression unreadable, but her eyes glistening slightly. "I didn't acknowledge your mother because I was afraid. Not of her, but of what it would cost me if people believed the rumors. If they thought I had compromised myself." He shook his head, looking down at his hands. "But she never compromised. She just disappeared." Naomi took a breath, her voice steady. "You can't undo the past, but you can choose what kind of man you want to be in the time you have left." He looked at her then, truly looked at her. There was no anger in her face, just conviction, sadness, strength. "I don't need you to rewrite history," she said, "but if you have the power to shine a light on what was buried and you don't, then the silence becomes yours, not hers." Charles nodded slowly. He had spent a lifetime crafting a legacy built on innovation, but it was this woman, this daughter he never raised, who now offered him a path to redemption. Not with money, not with press, but with truth. And for the first time in years, Charles Whitmore, billionaire, pioneer, icon, let himself cry, not for what he had lost, but for what he'd failed to see. The room was unusually quiet for a Whitmore Foundation press event. No holograms, no new product prototypes on display. Just a single wooden podium, a row of understated chairs, and a large framed photo of a woman many had never heard of. Anita Collins, her smile calm, her eyes bright with intellect. Cameras lined the back wall, red lights blinking steadily. Reporters clutched their notebooks, murmuring theories about the sudden announcement. Charles Whitmore didn't do unscheduled press conferences, and when he did, it was to introduce things that would change the future. Today, he was here to talk about the past. Charles stepped up to the podium slowly. No teleprompter, no notes. Just truth. "I've spent my life building things," he began, voice even but quieter than usual. "Companies, code, a public image, and like many men who build, I convinced myself that was enough." He paused. "But what you build is only as strong as what you honor." A few people exchanged glances. The cameras zoomed in closer. "I'm here today to publicly acknowledge someone I failed to honor." Her name was Anita Collins. She was a brilliant engineer, one of the earliest minds behind what would become Whitmore Systems. And she was silenced by a culture I helped create. A ripple moved through the crowd. "She was also," Charles added, steadying his voice, "the mother of my daughter." He let the words land. Cameras clicked, murmurs grew. "Her name is Naomi," he said, "and she didn't come to me asking for anything. She came to remind me of the kind of man I claim to be, and the kind I still have time to become." He gestured to the covered plaque beside the podium. An assistant pulled the cloth away, revealing a polished bronze dedication, the Anita Collins Scholarship Fund for Black Women in STEM, founded in truth, sustained by justice. "I'm donating a substantial portion of my personal estate to launch this fund," Charles continued, "because brilliance should never be buried, and because legacies aren't just about what we leave behind, they're about what we choose to uplift before we go." Applause rose slowly, uncertain at first, then steady. Charles stepped back from the microphone, not as a CEO or icon, but as a man finally facing the mirror. Weeks later, Naomi walked through the marble corridors of the Whitmore Foundation. Everything was the same: glass walls, modern art, quiet brilliance in motion. But her presence shifted the air. People nodded respectfully as she passed, not out of fear, but recognition. She stopped before the new wing. A plaque now bore two names: Anita Collins and Naomi Whitmore. Not as an heir, but as a partner. She placed her hand on the smooth surface for a moment, then continued down the hall, heels echoing in. The space her mother was never allowed to fill. Now it belonged to them both.